George W. Bush, when he actually used the term crusade in invading Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's the worst choice of words that he could have used. Because that is the way the Muslim world views us, is we're Christian crusaders trying to destroy their faith and using military power to do so, as well as economic means. We exploit them. At least that's the perception. You know, it is a sad thing when a person is brought up with the wrong perceptions and they have that drilled into their minds from day one. And I do feel for the Muslim people. So as somebody's pointed out, it seems kind of hopeless when is this not working? Okay. When they are told from their earliest moment that Christianity and Judaism has corrupted the teachings that we have. They say Muhammad came and straightened everything out and corrected all the mistakes or the mistakes made in the message, that we've corrupted the message of Jesus, we've corrupted the message of the Old Testament prophets, and yet they don't really give examples in any way of how they were supposedly corrupted. Historically, it's interesting to know that from the time that Muhammad died in 632 to the year 732, that Islam had taken over not only the Arabian Peninsula, but had gone down into North Africa, that had gone towards Europe. They had conquered Spain, and they were knocking on the door to take over all of the European countries, had it not been for the Battle of Tours in 732. That's quite phenomenal, to be honest, to think about such a rapid rise to power. And by the way, it was all through military conquest. It wasn't just a bunch of Muslim clerics going out and setting up shop and starting a mosque and teaching the people, and they willingly submitted to Islam. That's not it at all. Anyway, there is, in every history book that I've ever looked at, there is this period of time in which it's called the golden era of Islam. That's not the golden era. And what they're referring to is when the Muslims took over Spain. We have to admit that many of the Jews were treated better than the Christians in Spain had treated them. We have to admit that. We also kind of have to admit that Christians were treated pretty fairly while the Muslims were in charge of Spain. And they were in charge of Spain, had control of it for a long time. And that enabled Jewish scholars to study and to write great works. I don't really know of any great Christian works that came out of Spain during that period. But it's interesting to know that when the, and again, I'm using this term in the broadest sense of the word, when the Christians took back over Spain, when they regained the territory and drove the Muslim leaders out, it was just a couple of years before they sent Columbus on a little trip to see if he could find a new trade route. You just think about how certain events in history changed the world so dramatically. Would Columbus have ever been able to go if the Muslims had still been in control of Spain? It's very doubtful that would have ever taken place. Eventually, somebody would have discovered America, but it wouldn't have been Columbus had the Muslims maintained control. Well, one of the things that I've talked about too is understanding Islam. is that you have divisions within Islam. The most obvious are the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Shiites only make up about 15% of Islam. You also have the mystical side called the Sufis, which, to be honest, most of them have been killed out. And they probably offered the most peaceful form of Islam of the three different groups, but they've been just basically annihilated quietly. But there's also other divisions that we need to be aware of, and you are aware of. There's the ethnic division that is true of Islam. They claim, and I'm not going to say they don't do somewhat of a good job. They claim to put their brotherhood based on their faith above race, and I think they probably do a pretty decent job of that. But there is always that racial tension. Racism is in every part of society on some level. I'm not saying that's justified. You can't say it's justified. But you have the largest Muslim country in the world is the island nation of Indonesia. And what's been happening in Indonesia is pretty disturbing. Galen Jones' father actually used to preach in Indonesia, helped start a church or worked with churches there in Indonesia. There was a time where Indonesia was moderate Muslim. They didn't fight against Christianity by force. That's changed. That's changed recently. You've got the Bosnians, which certainly most of us, if you're out around Bowling Green very much at all, you've obviously run into Bosnians. Are the Bosnian Muslims like the Muslims of Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Iran? No, they're European, and they seem to have adapted pretty well to life in America. Now, I'll be honest with you, the Bosnian War is one of those instances where a fanatical Christian leader decided that he was going to take vengeance and purge all of the Muslims out of the country and establish basically a Catholic country, and that's Croatia, I guess, more so than Bosnia. But anyway, it was viewed as Christian people persecuting the Muslims. So we brought a lot of Bosnians over here. Have they adapted? Have we heard of any radical Bosnian Muslim? Not as far as I know. So Muslims can be peaceful people. They can fit in and adapt to society pretty well. It is when the Muslim population has the strongest voice that is a threat to the society around it. Now, I think about, and maybe it's in a very offensive comparison, but I don't mean for it to be. You look at Germany, and you just have to wonder, how did one man end up leading a country into such atrocities? Answer that for me. A lot of people didn't care. It was economic crisis. World War II, World War I had left them pretty bad shape. Plus, they were penalized to pay all the war damages to the other countries that they had inflicted, which they never could have done anyway. Also, part of their land was taken away from them, and they were very offended, and they ended up being basically humiliated after the war. Now, from our perspective, they should have been. But from their perspective, the penalties were unjust. But part of the reason somebody like Hitler rose to power was actually patriotism. He promoted the fatherland. And all Germans ought to be proud, and we ought to restore our pride back, and we ought to restore our territory back. There's something else that goes along with that. There has always been in Europe an anti-Jewish mindset, even though there were a lot of Jews in Europe. Now, why was there such a horrific mindset towards the Jews?
So it's weird, you get these disparate groups, the Nazis and the Soviets, the Jews. And even so, the Jews, in Europe, they were in all political parties. They were actually overrepresented in Italian fascism up until Germans took over Italy. And so I asked my mom this question, she goes, well, basically, she said, they are often the most successful group wherever they live. And because of that engenders hatred. I don't know if that was...
I think that is part of it. I think the roots of anti-Semitism go way back. We know about the royalty in most European countries. They had castles, they had a lot of land. They didn't have any money. And the Jews basically developed the banking system. And we tend to resent people that we owe money to. And that's a lot of it. Also, Martin Luther in Germany in particular. Martin Luther, the great reformer, a bizarre man, a great reformer, really talked about how the Jews were going to convert to Christianity once they got that Catholic Church straightened out. He was convinced that they were turned off by that, and he understood why, because the Catholic Church had persecuted the Jews. But he thought, once we get this figured out, then we'll convert the Jews. And so his Reformation movement was well underway, and no Jews were converting. And Martin Luther started writing sermons and treatises against the Jews that were horrific. They were horrific. And so we have to admit, a great Christian reformer also planted seeds of hatred. Then they had the Passion plays. Now, folks, I think our modern version of the Passion play is the movie, The Passion of Christ, by a horrible actor, Mel Gibson. He's just pitiful. Anyway, good movie though. I'm glad, because he wasn't in it. But anyway, I know ladies think he's the grandest thing ever, and he may be looks-wise. I don't know these kind of things. He's a horrific actor. But anyway, when we watched that, a few of us from church went, and I remember it was so emotional. Some of the women were just sobbing terribly. And by the way, I would recommend everybody watch the movie. But my first thought when I left that theater is I did not want to go out and beat up a bunch of Jews. But that used to be the reaction in Europe when the Passion plays were put on, and Jews were referred to as Christ killers, which makes no sense, which the Klan, that's what they used to say too, which makes no sense, because every Christian that ought to know anything ought to know that it was our sins that nailed Jesus to the cross, not just the Jews. But I'm going somewhere with this. how did World War II, how did Hitler end up and Germany end up where they were? Well, there's a lot of things that go into it, and you can't point to any one thing, but you have the economic difficulties, you have the humiliation of World War II, you've lost party territory, you've got a long-standing hatred for the Jews, even though the Jews helped build Germany's economy, the banking industry, and helped win and helped them fought valiantly, supported the cause in World War I. Hitler managed to say all the Jews were traitors. They lost World War I because of the Jews. And people already filled with somewhat a hatred towards the Jews bought into that. We're real quick to buy into stuff that we want to believe. That's true of all of us. And then Hitler got a bunch of power-hungry people on his side, the stormtroopers, which the German people so far outnumbered them, it's not even 99 to 1. The ratio would have been greater than that. And yet they were powerful figures. They beat anybody up that disagreed with them. And the next thing you got a whole nation pretty much going along with a crazy madman who had a hypnotic way of speaking, who appealed to their patriotism, who appealed to their pride, their national spirit, and their race. And so you allowed this one madman and a bunch of thugs to take over a nation and lead it, and basically lead us into a position where, 30, 40 million people lost their lives? And it doesn't even make sense. And this is all tying into what I'm getting at. That doesn't even make sense that Hitler, who believed the Aryan race was a superior race, joined up with the Italians, which he had no respect for them. And then their other partner is the Japanese, who the Japanese thought that they were by far the superior race. So you got three groups saying they're the superior race fighting together against the rest of the world. Makes no sense. So when you look at the mess that is true of Islam today, you've got Al-Qaeda, you've got Boko Haram, you've got ISIS, you've got the Taliban. And you say, what are they accomplishing? Why are they doing all of this? There's no easy answer except for hatred. You know, Dabo, is that the way you say his name? Dabo Swinney, coach at Clemson, was asked the question about race relations and the players kneeling during the African American players kneeling during the national anthem and all of that. And he took it a different direction than what most people wanted to hear. He said it's not a race problem, it's a sin problem. That's it, and bottom line, isn't it? Well, so is this whole deal of all of these radical groups, and that is what Islam is in danger of going through. All of that mess about Germany and Hitler is what I'm getting at. How many people does it take to turn a world religion into a radical group of people? It doesn't take that many. And so, yes, it is a great danger to not only America, it is a great danger to the world that these radical groups appeal to their pride, appeal to hate, appeal to fanaticism. It's a great risk that we run that all of these folks, this actually a small group of people, 10%, could take the whole religion hostage. That's a danger. Is it going to happen? I don't see it happening, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. And I think one of the things that can happen is that a lot of the Muslims can look at this hatred and see all of these acts of these barbaric acts and be disgusted and may be open to discussion about the gospel. But they've got to learn they've got to go against a lot of things that have been drilled into their heads since they were born. And they are taught, if you leave Islam, you die. I mean, how many people that are Christians just quit over petty things? So if you don't want to be a part of us, there's a door out. And people take it all the time. But in Islam, the way out ends in death. So are we playing on a level playing field? Absolutely 100% no. Can we have dialogue in which and that's what it's going to take. We've got to start talking to each other. Can we have dialogue with the Muslim world? To be perfectly honest, not unless we're in a country that truly believes in freedom of religion. Because if you go to Iran and you pick up your Bible and you lay it on top of the Quran, you're subject to be put to death. If you lay any book on top of the Quran, you're subject to be put to death. For you to take the Bible and say, okay, here's what Muhammad says, but here's what the Bible says. Let's talk about this. You see, this is a religion that keeps its people through fear. That doesn't mean that they don't love their religion, but they keep people through fear. So what do? I want us to start doing something, and I'm going to try to work it into a couple of lessons. And me working stuff into lessons doesn't always work because I got a bunch of stuff to work in. But I think you and I need to devote time in the study of Scripture, more time than what we're doing. I'm convinced that the more technology that we have and the more access to information we have, the less we know about the Bible. I think most of us used to sit around. I told my grandkids this. My three oldest grandkids, they bought a new house and we went to see it. And there's this bookshelf that's got a bunch of archaic books on it. Which set of books do you think I'm referring to as archaic? Yeah. I told my grandkids, I said, here's what I used to do every night. I would get a volume of the encyclopedia and I would get my Bible and I'd read both before I went to bed at night. Lynn's always saying, whenever they ask a question, I'll give them an answer, and she'll say, he's making it up. No, I know what I'm talking about. And they will look it up. And then she'll say, it's like it's a surprise to her that I know anything. She'll say, how do you know this stuff? I said, because I read. And I used to read World Book Encyclopedia every night, along with my Bible. Now what do we read? Wikipedia. Yeah, the source that is never wrong. You know, anybody can go in and put stuff on Wikipedia. You know that? That's so crazy. For instance, when Tennessee hired the basketball coach after I can't even remember his name. The guy left us, went to California, and we hired a little short guy that was a cheater at Southern Miss. Anyway, I go to find out about him, and I'm reading his his biography on Wikipedia, and somebody had gone in the day they hired him and had typed in, "And thus begins another long period of miserable basketball at UT." Which they were right, I guess. But anyway, hatred. It's such a powerful force. But we need to get back to reading the Bible. We need to read the Quran. We need to be entering into dialogue. This is what I want to work into a sermon. I think until we start becoming intentional about trying to reach people, I don't care whether Muslim or unchurched. Ralph sent out an email, I guess, to the elders, and I don't know if he sent it to the deacons, but Barna Research, which their stats are usually padded, but Barna says that there are 56% or 46% of adults in America that are now fall into the unchurched category. I've been saying that for a long time. It's not. I don't think it's that high, but it's a lot higher than it ever has been in the history of America. We got to figure out how to reach people. We got to figure out how to reach Muslims. We got to figure out how to reach all these people that no longer see church as an important part of their life. And the only way we're going to do that is we've got to be intentional in we always talk about seeking and saving the lost. We don't even know how anymore. I don't know how. But I think part of it is we're just going to have to start entering into a dialogue with people, whether it be Muslim, whether it be a Hindu, whether it be Buddhist, whether it be somebody that sees no point in going to church. We've got to figure out how to talk to these people. And the only way, I am convinced, is that we start talking. We learn through experience, through trying. The first 2 or 3 times you talk to a Muslim, you're not going to have great success. That's just the bottom line. You may get ripped up because a lot of Muslims know their material. They know it. Whereas we still won't teach a class, a lot of us, because we don't think we know enough, even though we've been in church our whole life. There's something wrong with that. But anyway, we got to start being intentional. We got to look for conversation. And I tell you something I really want us to do, and I don't know if it'll ever work. I'm going to try to get a bunch of Church of Christ people to try to tell what Jesus means to them. And until we can tell that story to other people, all we've got is facts. Facts are good. But a living, we talk about the only Bible some people will read is you. Well, let's let them hear that Jesus does mean something to us. He means the world to us. We've got to get comfortable saying that. I think that's a good start. Okay, the Muslims start advancing. They take over Iran. There's that ethnic division of Persians versus Arabs. They reach over into Europe. So you have a different kind of Muslim there. Turkey, for a long, long time, viewed itself as a secular state with a whole lot of Muslims in it. They're now drifting back toward the giving in to the radicals. You've got Pakistan, which had for a while was somewhat close to being moderate, but they're becoming more radicalized. Why? It's this pressure of people that are filled with hate, and people are buying into it. So what do we do long term? Well, I don't have the answers to that. I wished I did, but then if I did, nobody would listen because, I get to speak to 250 people. I don't get to speak to movers and shakers in the world. Can a Muslim, here's something. Can a Muslim live in a pluralistic society and still be true to their faith? Well, first of all, we need to understand that America is a pluralistic society. We often view ourselves as Mayberry, at least that's what I would hope for, Mayberry with a lot more churches than the All Souls Church that Andy went to. Have you ever noticed that? That doesn't make sense. In North Carolina, you think about during the days of Andy Griffith, there was one church that they mentioned, in what world would that be true in the South? It would have been All Souls Church 1 and All Souls Church East. And then there's the Baptist and Methodist and everything else. But they just talk about one. But anyway, we live in a pluralistic society. Whether we want to admit it or not, we now have more Hindus in America than we have members of the Church of Christ. We have a bunch of Buddhists. We're now we have freedom of religion that allows instances such as the fact that we have a Wiccan chaplain in the military. You know what Wicca is? It's ancient nature worship is all the world it is. But they petition, and by the way, I think it's just about died out, but they petitioned the government, they got a chaplain, and basically the ruling was, okay, you can practice your religion, but if you start running around naked and howling at the moon, we no longer will let you have a place of worship here on our base. That was in San Antonio, Texas. Can they live in a pluralistic society? Yes, they can. They already are in America, in Canada, in Europe. 10% of the population, and I think in France it's probably up to 15% of the population is Muslim. How do they adapt to European society, American society, a pluralistic society? How do they adapt? Well, up until now, you'd have to say fairly well. Up until about 20 years ago, fairly well. Now you've got this extreme brand of Islam in the countries to the point that the city of France, the nation of France, that's a country in danger of a group of people filled with hate being taken over. I mean, that really is. They have large sections of cities that a non-Muslim cannot go into, the police can't go into. There's parts of London that is true. Did you know that if one of them decides that they're on a jihad, if only one, they can rape any non-Muslim woman, and it's not a sin nor a crime as far as they're concerned. That's part of Sharia law. If they want to keep you for a month or two and then discard you, they have this provision called temporary wives. Islam allows you can have as many as you want, but you're supposed to only have 4 wives. I'm not a conspiracist. I'm not. But those documentaries, or whatever you call them, they're not really documentaries, those stage shows that show the Mormons that practice polygamy are just setting us up and getting us ready to accept it as a way of life for the radical Mormons and the Muslim population. I guarantee there's already people living here in America, Muslims, that have more than one wife, and maybe 2 or 3 wives. And since some of the wives are not legally married, how do they get by? It's real simple. You know, everybody knows that if you've watched the news, Greece has been going bankrupt for the past 20 years. Has anybody ever wondered why Greece is going bankrupt? It's because they got so many Muslim immigrants and they're on welfare. And if you're on welfare, or if you're a male and you're working in Greece, and you have 3 other wives back in Africa somewhere, they get welfare checks from the Greek government because you don't make enough to support 4 wives and a bunch of kids. That's true in most socialistic countries in Europe. So what are they going to do? Are they going to adapt our ways and say, okay, it's legal only to have 1 wife? We have to recognize the law. Right now, there's not a problem in America. We keep letting radicals in this country, and we're going to start having more and more problems with issues like that. You know, the thing that amazes me, and since I'm running out of time, the thing that amazes